This is Real Estate Real Talk, a weekly podcast about real estate industry news that actually matters, hosted by some of the industry's leading agents. Here are this week's hosts.
Welcome to the Real Estate Real Talk podcast. Today, we're talking with Nate Johnson about fair housing. I'm so glad you joined us today. Nate, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about your real estate career?
This is my 27th year as a realtor in St. Louis, and I love every minute of it. Okay, I'm kidding. I don't love every minute of it, but it's a great career, and I've been blessed to be a part of this wonderful, dynamic industry. I first got involved in real estate because, I shouldn't say because, I actually didn't understand exactly how real estate works. I didn't grow up in a home that my family owned, so as a result, I had never experienced home ownership until I became an adult. And once I found out about a job as a real estate agent existed, I was very, very attracted to it and jumped right in.
27 years. That's great. Awesome, Nate. Now, I know you're also an instructor. Can you tell us what being an instructor means to you and how it's valuable to your career?
Sure. I started instructing courses over a dozen years ago, and I didn't intend to be an instructor. However, the education director at my local association tapped me on the shoulder one day and said, Nate, I think you'd be a great instructor. I want you to instruct the new member orientation class next month. And so that kind of started the path of instructing. And, once I got comfortable with that, she's like, okay, I want you to teach this class. I want you to teach that class. And before you know it, I started writing classes of my own and started to have people reach out to me from other markets around the country asking if I would instruct for them. And so once that was happening, I realized, oh, well, this is a real business, and I probably should be more intentional about it and sort of fold it into how I'm helping people buy and sell real estate in St. Louis. And so I started instructing and started being more intentional about those opportunities. And so now, over a dozen years later, I have a great opportunity to talk with realtors and other community leaders all around the country about a variety of issues and opportunities from smart growth and sustainability to fair housing and diversity, as well as leadership and professional development and business and sales development as well. So it's a phenomenal opportunity. It's a very rewarding to be able to do that and provide that value for my fellow realtors.
Well, April is Fair Housing Month, so perfect timing to have you on, Nate. Can you explain the concept of fair housing, why it's so important, especially with the real estate industry?
Absolutely. The Fair Housing Act was passed in April of 1968, which is why Fair Housing Month lands here in April. And that was on the heels of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who worked tirelessly during the civil rights movement to advance housing opportunities for everyone. And so historically in our country, we've had a lot of challenges as it relates to creating equitable opportunities for all Americans. Quite frankly, we as realtors were a part of those challenges as well. And it goes all the way back. I could say the Civil Rights Bill of 1866 was the sort of first legislation that discussed the rights that African Americans and others had as it relates to housing opportunities. And at the time, that particular legislation said that citizens, regardless of any previous condition of slavery or involuntary servitude, shall have the same rights in every state and territory to own, sell, lease, convey, and hold real and personal property as is enjoyed by white citizens. And so that was supposed to end housing discrimination, but as we know, it didn't quite work. And so then we move forward. And as I mentioned, the next Fair Housing Act came out in 1968 in April. And so the years from 1865 1968, there were a lot of trials and tribulations in terms of how people had access to housing. And the majority of that period of time, we've seen that access to housing has not been created equally and has not been available for everyone. And even once we saw the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968, there wasn't a magic wand that was waved that all of a sudden eliminated housing discrimination and racism in America. We still, to this very day in 2026, have challenges to fair housing that, some of us, myself included, work tirelessly to try to overcome.
That's really important to keep in mind. Just because the Fair Housing Act passed doesn't mean that the work is done. The challenges evolve over time. So, how have you seen the fair housing challenges evolve over the years? And what are the new challenges and misconceptions that arise today?
Yeah, that's a great question. When we look at, and you kind of hit the nail on the head when you said that it looks a little bit differently. Because at the time, so if we go back to the time prior to the Fair Housing Act, you would see signs that would say things like, we want white tenants in our white community, no blacks, no Jews, no Irish, no Hispanics, things like that we would see all over. And so that was a level of overt discrimination and overt racism. And so once we saw the passage of the Federal Fair Housing Act, a lot of that went underground. And then we sort of saw a shift from overt discrimination to covert discrimination, where you still had some of the very same challenges. They just weren't as in your face. And that, quite frankly, makes it more challenging in many ways because you don't know when you're being discriminated against. We've seen testing scenarios by organizations all throughout the country over the years. And one of the most recent high level testing scenarios was in 2020, where we saw that, and this was testing real estate agents in Long Island, and this was by Newsday magazine. And what occurred is that they showed that if you are Asian, you have a nearly 30% chance of being shown different homes than your white counterparts. If you're Hispanic, you have a nearly 40 chance of being shown homes in different neighborhoods. And if you're black, you've got a nearly 50% chance of being shown different homes in different neighborhoods than your white counterparts. And this is with someone that has the same credit qualifications, the same search criteria. They're being shown different homes. That's of course very sad to me. And what's even more sad than that is the reality that I believe that that could occur and that does occur in markets all across our country. And what's also disappointing about that and disturbing is that many of the folks that face discrimination don't even realize that they're facing it. And that I think is a key difference from how it looks today versus how it looked in 1960s.
Exactly. And when it comes to agents, you often hear the term unconscious bias, right? So they could be violating the Fair Housing Act without even realizing it. And what are some of the common violations or missteps that you see agents making? What's important for agents to be intentional about, conscious of at this moment to make sure that they're treating all of their clients equally and fairly?
Yeah. So some strategies that we can employ as agents is to adopt the equal professional services model. And what that looks like is, do I have policies in place that helps ensure that I'm going to treat people the same? Do I have objective information? Is someone pre-approved or aren't they? And how am I going to respond based on that? What is the policy that I have in place that ensures that I'm going to treat people the same that are in the same situation? Have I provided a variety of choices? Am I the one that set the criteria, or is it the client? Because what we find is that as realtors, and real estate agents, we don't make decisions. We provide choices, and it's up to the client to actually make the decision. So when we find ourselves in a space where we're making decisions, we're doing it wrong, quite frankly. And what we know is that our clients will often put us in a position to make decisions for them. They want that support. They sometimes want us to be responsible for their decision, but we cannot sort of fall victim to that, because when we do that, what we find ourselves doing is allowing our own bias to come into play as it relates to decisions that someone is making. And you mentioned bias, and the bias is so incredibly important because implementing those systems and standard procedures that I just mentioned is what's critical, because we don't know what we don't know as it relates to our biases. And they're going to come to play when we least expect it. And we don't even know that we're allowing a bias that that's been implanted in us by our parents, maybe by whoever else may have raised us, our other family members, our teachers, the media, our friends, books we've read, movies we've watched. All those things have an influence on us. And we've all have different lived experiences. And those lived experiences result in who we are. And a lot of those biases that we have served us in the past by keeping us safe, from things that we know. We know that this knife is sharp. Let's not grab it with our bare hand. That's something that we understand is going to be the case. But the sort of biases work the same way when it deals with people. Because if we've been taught that certain people are not good or certain people are dangerous, even if we consciously don't believe that, unconsciously we may act in a way that's consistent with that false belief. And we can't help it. We all have these unconscious biases. And so the best way for us to mitigate those biases is to ensure that we're adopting standard operating procedures and an equal professional service model. Another way that we can work to overcome those biases is by ensuring that we are seeking to be intentional. What I like to tell people, if you're not intentionally inclusive, you're unintentionally exclusive. And what we do is we'll have a tendency to go to a party or go to a meeting or go to an event, and we connect with people that we know. And often those people that we know look just like us. And so we have to be intentional about reaching out to those that don't look like us, those that may be of a different ethnicity, may be differently abled, different gender, different age demographic, different socioeconomic demographic, all of these various points of difference as it relates to identity. Because as we reach out to folks that are different, then it allows us to better connect and understand various perspectives. And the more that we can understand multiple perspectives, the better position we are to help someone achieve their goals in an unbiased way.
Nate, when people hear fair housing, the average listener might assume it only applies to race and ethnicity. But there are many groups, as you just listed, that fall under different categories that would be protected under the Fair Housing Act. What are some groups or some scenarios that fall under fair housing that the average agent should be conscious of when considering fair housing?
For several years, I served as president of the Metropolitan St. Louis Equal Housing Opportunity Council, which is a private nonprofit fair housing agency. And one of the things that we saw consistently, and this is true across the country as well, is that the number one complaint in terms of fair housing discrimination is not race. It is actually based on disability. And so that's a factor that we really need to understand that, that's protected class disability, and we can find ourselves inadvertently discriminating by not knowing what we don't know and how we're acting with people. If we go back to the Fair Housing Act of 1968, we know that race, color, religion, and national origin, those are the four original groups that are protected. And then in 1974, we added gender as a protected class. You believe that? 1974 wasn't that long ago. It was perfectly legal for someone to deny housing opportunities to women simply because they are women. And in fact, in 1974, you've got congressmen in the United States House of Representatives beating their fists on the table on the podium saying that we should not have to sell homes to women because if we sell homes to women, they're not going to be able to keep them up like a man can. And as a result, property values are going to go down in those neighborhoods. I mean, that's incredible to think that it wasn't that long ago. I often tell people as I'm instructing courses is that 1865 wasn't that long ago when I kind of start the conversation when we talk about that original Civil Rights Act, because it really wasn't that long ago when we think about how many generations have existed in our country since then. It's not been a whole lot. And so we need to recognize that as we're looking at how we've been influenced. And so then after we look at 1974, we move on to 1988. And in 1988, we saw the Fair Housing Amendments Act, which amended the Fair Housing Act to include disability and familial status. So familial status is another one that people miss and don't think about. It's not marital status. It's about children under the age of 18. And so it's the presence or potential presence of children under the age of 18. And so a space where I find realtors make mistakes with this category is violating the Fair Housing Act unintentionally because of having, quote, the best interest in mind for the client. And so what that looks like is, let's take a condo development. So you know that there's condos available on the first and second floor. There's also condos that are available on the 8th and ninth floor of a building overlooking the pool with the balcony. And so your client has 3 and 5-year-old boys and they're pretty rambunctious. And you're thinking, wow, you know what? If I had 3 and 5-year-old boys, I wouldn't want them to have access to the balcony and the pool, throw their toys over, throw their brother over into the pool. Nobody wants that. So because I'm looking out for my client's best interest, I'm only going to show them the units on the first and second floor. And so even though we, quote, had our client's best interest in mind, it still results in a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act. And so those are the kind of areas where we go wrong. We thought somebody might be more comfortable over here. Or because we weren't prepared for an answer that a client gave us, we answer in the wrong way. Meaning a client may come to us and say, hey, I want to live in a community with people that look just like me. And because we're caught off guard and we haven't prepared an answer, we say, okay, well, I think that people that look like you live over here. And now we find ourselves in violation because we've not prepared. One of the best ways to answer that question when people talk about the racial identity or ethnic identity of a particular neighborhood is to help them understand that, it would be a violation of the Federal Fair Housing Act for me to discuss the racial makeup of a neighborhood. So that's something that I'm not able to talk about. I'd encourage you to do your own research to determine if this neighborhood meets the qualifications and standards that you feel comfortable with. And that gets you out of it so you're not at risk. And so when we don't practice and we don't prepare, then what ends up happening is we could find ourselves in a pinch saying the wrong thing because it just comes out because we've not prepped for it. And so when we look at other areas in terms of protections based on identity, also have the National Association of Realtors has 2 additional groups that are protected, and that is sexual orientation and gender identity. And so those are 2 areas that are also protected in terms of our National Association of Realtors Code of Ethics. So those are spaces that we want to be careful of as well. I hate to sound like a broken record, but having procedures in place is so important because by having those procedures in place, ensuring that we treat everyone the same, it really does just that. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, we also have to make sure that we're learning that we are, that we're working to build connections across all types of diverse levels of identity. Because as we're doing that, it's going to make us better professionals and better agents for our clients. And at the end of the day, that's what we're all looking for. You've got folks that are looking to achieve their real estate goals, whether it's selling a home or buying a home. And then you've got us that are making a living, helping people, make the largest financial decision that they'll ever make in their life for the most part. And it's really important and it's really serious. And we should be making sure that we take advantage of all the educational opportunities that are available to us, that we're taking advantage of opportunities to learn and listen so that we can become better versions of ourselves so we can better serve our clients and customers.
Seeing as how you teach courses on fair housing, do you have some key takeaways from those classes that agents can start implementing to make sure they're being compliant with the Fair Housing Act?
Sure. I think that, one of the things that we want to do is we want to talk less and listen more. We want to be receptive to what our client has to say. Sometimes we find ourselves saying more than what we're listening to. And when we do that, it's possible that something may be missed in that conversation, and we may not be creating that sense of psychological safety, which is going to help our client feel that we're the best person to represent them and helping them achieve their real estate goals. We want to really work to, again, have systems in place. Systems are going to help us, systems and protocols. I mean, I can't say that enough because it's so important because we have a tendency, and I say we're going to, because we all have these implicit biases. And when we don't sort of rein them in by having standard operating procedures, then we're going to find ourselves inadvertently violating the Fair Housing Act potentially. And we can't make exceptions to that. So we've got to make our policy such that it doesn't allow room for exceptions. And so if we have to make exceptions, we need to adjust our policy because the exceptions is where it's going to really get us in trouble. Because if we have a person of one identity that we've made an exception for and someone else of a different identity who we haven't made an exception for, and somehow that comes to light, we've got a problem. And that's not what we want to have. And so, learning and understanding that there are a couple things that we can't talk about. We can't talk about safety of the neighborhood. We can't talk about who lives in the neighborhood. Let's focus on talking about the property, not the people. We can't talk about crime in the neighborhood. Those types of things are things that we want to stay away from. And when we are providing any sort of information about a community, we want to make sure that that information is consistent and that we're doing it for everyone. So if we think that this particular person is going to want information about this neighborhood, then we need to make sure we're providing similar information about every neighborhood that we're showing, because we don't want to just provide information about this particular neighborhood because we feel like our client really needs to know what's going on here. Don't they need to know what's going on everywhere? And don't we have a responsibility to provide objective information so that they can make their best decision about what's going to be best for them in terms of the neighborhood that they select?
Nowadays, with technology and AI, agents are drafting listings and using technology to help with day to day tasks. I've heard from agents that sometimes AI could be unconsciously violating the Fair Housing Act within the language it uses or descriptions about neighborhoods, for example, that shouldn't be included. Have you seen this? And if so, what are some of the important safeguards for agents to use to make sure that they're being compliant and above board with every tool that they're using?
Yes, technology is very valuable to us, of course, and it creates some challenges too. We have to remember, especially when we're looking at AI, all of that information is based on information that is found on the internet. And as we know, that information can sometimes be biased. So, what it does is it creates a biased output for us. And so that's why we have to be vigilant in reviewing everything that our chat bots are putting out for us, so to speak. And a good strategy that I would say that one can employ for that is to upload the code of ethics. Upload the NAR code of ethics to your service of choice. I happen to use ChatGPT, and I love it for a variety of things. And sometimes I ask questions and they're just flat wrong. So we have to make sure that we are monitoring and that we are proofreading any information that comes out of there and feeding information that we want to be shared back to us. Because if we're allowing it to just go unfettered across the internet, then you got a good shot at you're going to have some information that is not accurate or that could put you in violation of the Fair Housing Act. Because of course, your chatbot doesn't understand what the Fair Housing Act is. Responsibility to educate them to have that level of understanding. And that also is another space where we find ourselves potentially in violation, and that is through screening. And so when I think about the top ways that realtors find themselves in trouble, it's through steering and screening. And steering was the example that I shared about the condo development and familial status in terms of showing the units on the first and second floor as opposed to the higher units because of the person having small children. And so when we look at screening occurs by providing different information to different people based on who they are, based on their identity. And one of the ways this often happens is through what we call linguistic profiling. And so where we use the sound of someone's voice to make a determination about who they are, may perhaps whether we feel that they're qualified or not, their ethnicity, their gender, all of these various points of difference in identity. I've had people tell me in the past, well, this person just sounds qualified. Well, what does that mean when someone sounds qualified? Because what you're saying is that there's a way that some people sound that makes them sound not qualified. And as we know, that really creates the atmosphere for a violation, because just based on that, what you're saying is that you treat people differently based on how they sound. And that is going to land someone in hot water in terms of fair housing laws and our code of ethics right away. And so when we're looking at, again, how are we treating people? What is it that we're doing that, that ensures that we're treating people the same way? And getting back to, the technology, our best bet is to describe the property, not the people that are going to be in it. And when we're providing information, we want to be the source of the source, but not the source, okay? Because our information could be skewed, but if we're the source of the information, then that helps limit our liability. And so, for example, when someone's asking us about crime or safety in a neighborhood, we may want to share with them, hey, you know what? I'd encourage you to reach out to the local police department to get information about that. There are other resources that you could find online that may help satisfy you in terms of the condition. Talk to the neighborhood association, maybe visit the Nextdoor page or the Facebook page, things like that. And that keeps us out of here, I'm going to send you an email with these resources, then basically showing crime statistics and things like that, which is going to get us in trouble again, because, that's not the type of information that we want to share directly. We want to help them discover where they can find that information if that's important to them. And what that does is that allows us to tell them what we can and can't do, but it also provides them with a resource so that they feel and we feel like we're just telling them no, because we're not. We're telling them what we can do and we're telling them where to find the information that's important to them, the other information.
It's really common to see things in listings like you can raise a family in this home. Small things like that violate the Fair Housing Act. So it's important to have the conversation about all the details that come into play when it comes to the Fair Housing Act. And beyond compliance, what are some things that agents can do to promote inclusivity and equality when it comes to working with their clients or even building out their brokerages?
Sure. So using the equal housing opportunity logo is a very low hanging fruit opportunity for us to demonstrate our commitment to fair housing. I always like to advise people to make sure that diversity shows up in everything that they do in terms of their buyer guide, their home seller guide, their listing presentation, any marketing and advertising. Make sure they have different types, different identity in there. And I'm not talking just about race. I'm talking about level of ability. I'm talking about, gender. I'm talking about religion. You want to show difference and just show that you are a realtor that is committed to fair housing. And when you are attending fair housing courses, let that be known. Post that type of information on your social media outlets. Put that information in your e-letter, your newsletter, or whatever other communications you're using with your clients, because then that demonstrates that commitment. Share a tidbit about what you learned that could be helpful to the public. And those types of steps can really show a commitment that someone has for fair housing. And that has a business case to it, because what happens then is when people see that, well, this person is committed to fair housing, then wow, that may be the type of agent that I want to work with. That's someone who I want to refer or recommend as well. At designations such as the At Home with Diversity designation that the National Association of Realtors offers, that again shows a commitment to fair housing by taking education above and beyond what's required just to maintain your license. Taking the RRC fair housing courses and others. There's a treasure trove of information here, and it all works to protect you in terms of keeping you from violating the Fair Housing Act by educating you on what it actually means, but also in helping you develop business as a result of your embracing of equity and inclusion.
We're having this conversation because April is Fair Housing Month, but the conversations, the learning, the implementation shouldn't end at the end of April. What other advice can you share with our listeners about the important topic of fair housing?
This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate the questions that you've asked. I really just want to make sure that agents understand that, fair housing begins and ends with us. We are the keepers of the American dream. That's the business that we're in. So we need to take that role very seriously and look at ways within our business that we see that we may be unintentionally limiting housing opportunities and choices for people. Those are the spaces that can become rife with areas of discrimination unintentionally. And so we need to really do an audit on our business and on our practices so that we see exactly what it looks like to work with us. And if we find holes in that, which we likely will, then we work to improve those holes. Excellence is a moving target, and none of us are going to be perfect, but the work is in the continued pursuit of perfection in terms of making sure that we are constantly educating ourselves, working to be inclusive in our communities, working to create connections with people that have different identities than we have. Because when we're doing that and we're intentionally inclusive, it really, really works towards creating a fruitful business, and it really helps to ensure that we're on the right side of fair housing laws and realtor policies and our code of ethics.
Especially right now, this place, this time, it's so important to follow fair housing guidelines. And as real estate agents, it's one of the careers where it is the most important to be inclusive and to help everyone equally, no matter what they look like, or their situation, or their background. Now, before I let you go, since you are an instructor with RRC, I want to give you the opportunity to share some of the courses where listeners can find you teaching for the Residential Real Estate Council.
Now you're catching me off guard. A lot of the courses that I instruct certainly, are around business development. So courses like listing strategies for residential specialists, effective buyer sale strategies, buying and selling income properties, mastering your time to achieve your goals. We've got, win-win negotiation tactics. That's one of the courses that I most recently instructed. And, a variety of others. And so if you look at my credentials on the RRC site, you'll find the sort of treasure trove of courses that I instruct from, building a team to grow your business and mastering relevant marketing, all of those types of things. It's so important for us in terms of helping our clients achieve their goals to make sure that we're staying on the cutting edge and the forefront of what's available to us as realtors and things that can help us in terms of, making us more efficient in our time. And by being more efficient and more effective, that's going to serve our clients at a higher level. And one of the things that we've got to realize is that as realtors, we're typically not paid by the hour. And so our time is extremely important to us in terms of how we're managing that. Because what I often will tell people is that we can't manage time, we can manage ourselves within time. So we have to work to make sure that we're doing that at a very high level. And some of the recent AI courses, I instruct some of those for RRC as well. And it's incredible because I think that that is one of our most important time management tools that we have, right now. So I tell you, I am so passionate about this business. This, as I mentioned, 27 years I've been helping people achieve their real estate goals. And it's a great honor and privilege to be able to talk with realtors about how they can help others achieve their goals as well.
And I know you've been really busy with classes around fair housing as well. Can you share anything with your life as an instructor, some aha moments in the classroom, or why you think that education is so important?
I think that the answer to that question varies in terms of, those aha moments. But I will say since this is Fair Housing Month and that's the topic of our conversation, some of the best moments that I have is, when someone comes into a class and they have to be there because it's mandatory, they need it for their continuing education. And I can see them, they've got their arms crossed, they're being very closed and defensive. What's this guy got to say? And then, by the end of the class or by the middle of the class, they'll come up to me and they'll say, "Hey, Nate, you know what? Thank you for what you've presented today. I had no idea that this is what happened and that this is the reality that we're facing and that this is why we've got some of the challenges that we've got. I really appreciate your perspective. And I value you as, as someone who came from a space of understanding and not a space of blaming and judgment." And I think that that's the type of feedback that really gives me a chill because someone who was changed based on what I shared with them. They came into the room with a perspective that they left with a completely different one. And so because of that, those folks that now have a greater understanding of fair housing rules and regulations and laws and the history of how our country came to where we're at today, when they have that sort of aha and that awakening, and they then understand so much more about our country and so much more about the reality and why we've seen such inequitable outcomes in our communities. It's because of some of this rich history that dates back over 100 years. And that's why we've created some of the communities and the segregated outcomes that we see today. So when somebody shares that with me that I've, changed their heart and mind as it relates to how they understand fair housing, it's worth all the plane rides and all the late nights and sleepless nights sometimes in the hotel rooms to be able to have that, create that outcome for people. It's really enriching and rewarding for me to have that outcome and experience with people.
Nate, thank you so much for coming on the podcast to share your knowledge with us. I think it was a really timely and impactful discussion. It was just a brief look into fair housing, but I encourage all of our listeners to take a course, to dive deeper, to keep learning more. All right. Nate, are there any thoughts you'd like to end on?
No, it's been great to be with you today, and thanks for having me, and thanks for allowing me to share some insight that I have on this extremely important topic. Fair housing is not something that just occurs in April. We need fair housing every month and every day. So I hope that all my RRC family and realtor colleagues join me in committing to promoting fair housing and inclusivity in all of our communities. So thank you very much.
All right. That's all for our podcast for today. Thank you for joining us for the Real Estate Real Talk podcast. We're really grateful that Nate Johnson was able to be with us. Thanks for joining. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to Real Estate Real Talk. If you like what you just heard, we hope you'll pass along our web address, crs.com/realtalk, to your friends and colleagues. Please leave us a positive review wherever you listen to our podcast, and be sure to check out our archive section on our website for previous episodes. This has been a Residential Real Estate Council production. Join us next time for another edition of Real Estate Real Talk.